Are We There Yet? The First Road Trip Across the USA. Written by Stacy McAnulty, illustrated by Elizabeth Baddeley. This is the absolutely true story of a ridiculous journey that started as a bet, turned into a race, and ended in well, hang on and see how it turns out. May 1903, San Francisco, California. One evening, a group of gentlemen got into an argument over horseless carriages, or cars as they're now called. Most thought the newfangled vehicle was simply a toy for zipping around town, definitely not practical for long journeys. Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson totally disagreed. He believed the automobile was the future of travel. Someone offered up a bet, $50 if he could drive a horseless carriage across the country in less than 3 months. Jackson, who was visiting from Vermont and had to get home anyway, took the wager, a bold and possibly foolish decision. Why foolish? First, America lacked decent roads back in the early 1900s. Cities and towns had streets, but highways? Nope. Second, Jackson couldn't buy cross country road maps anywhere because they didn't exist. Third, others had tried to drive across the United States and failed, and those people were mechanics and automobile experts. Jackson did not even know how to drive. However, he had money, and more importantly, a stubborn, nothing will stop me spirit. For 4 days, Jackson prepared for his grand adventure. He hired Sewell Crocker, a 22-year-old bicycle racer, to be his mechanic, travel buddy, and driving instructor. Then he bought a used Winston touring car, which he named the Vermont. It lacked the luxuries we expect in today's cars. Things like a windshield, seat belts, mirrors, doors, a trunk, or a roof. And just like that, Jackson and Crocker were ready. Sort of. May 23rd, 1903. San Francisco, California. On a Saturday afternoon, the pair set out for New York City. And just 15 miles into the journey, pop! They blew a tire and had to replace it with their only spare. Not the start they'd hoped for. But nobody would give up on the first day. Certainly not Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson. On day 2, Jackson began thinking they needed a mascot. A dog. It's not clear why, except that everyone knows dogs are awesome. He joked that he might just dog nap one if he had to. While Jackson dreamed of what the journey was missing, things actually began to go missing. As they drove down the bumpy roads, boingy, 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 their cooking gear bounced free. The roads were rough, sure, but at least they had some roads. Bridges, on the other hand, were few and far between. Outside Montgomery, California, the men tried to drive the Vermont across a creek and got stuck. So they stripped off their shoes and pants, walked through the water in their undies, and used rope to free the Vermont. But as they began moving once again, boingy, 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 Jackson's glasses and fountain pen bounced free. After 1 week, they were still in California, over 3,000 miles from New York. Was Jackson considering giving up? Nope. He wrote home, with a different pen, "I feel confident we can make it." The Vermont needed parts that weren't for sale in Alturas, California. So Jackson had to place an order by telegram and get the supplies sent by stagecoach. Yes, the horseless carriage had to wait for a horse and carriage delivery. And wait, and wait, and wait. After 4 days, a frustrated but determined Jackson decided to leave without his new parts. He was in a race against the clock after all, but the Vermont made it only a few miles before, snap, a spring broke. The vehicle went from 30 miles per hour to less than 10. But even at this turtle-like speed, Boingy, boingy, boingy. Another pen, a hat, and a coat bounced free. When they crawled into Lakeview, Oregon, a large crowd gathered to see the first horseless carriage ever in Lake County. Jackson and Crocker had a choice: give up or wait for the stagecoach delivery. They waited and waited and waited yet again. Finally, the supplies arrived. On day 15, they left Lakeview and immediately got lost. Then the engine clogged with dust, and then the batteries gave out. They were stuck. Until a cowboy happened by, and Jackson asked him for a tow. The horseless carriage was horseless no more. The cowboy pulled them to a ranch for repairs. Did they have any good days? Yes. June 12th, a man offered to sell Jackson a dog named Bud for $15. Jackson jumped at the opportunity. This meant he wouldn't have to dog nap one. Bud was so ugly he was handsome. And, like Crocker and Jackson, he sat in the front and wore goggles to keep dust out of his eyes. The three of them set out to win a bet and make history. Bud was an excellent travel companion, guarding the Vermont at night and leaning into turns like an expert motorist. But he didn't change their luck. They continued to get stuck. They continued to get lost. And they continued to lose stuff. First, they lost a part of the engine. Jackson had to telegram the factory to get a new one. Then, Jackson lost another coat, and with it, most of his money. He had to ask his generous, wealthy wife to send him $200. They also lost their food and were forced to go to sleep hungry. Maybe this would be a good time to quit. No, Jackson pressed on. Until now, the Vermont had only been racing the clock. Not anymore. On June 20th, another team left San Francisco to cross the country in their brand new Packard automobile. While Jackson had spent a measly 4 days preparing for the journey, Team Packard had been getting ready for 3 months. Vroom, vroom, the race was on. Were Bud and his buddies now the underdogs? Jackson didn't think so. Of Team Packard, he wrote, "I feel confident they will give it up." Day 29. Traveling along the Green River, Crocker and Jackson hadn't eaten in 36 hours, and they joked that Bud was starting to look tasty. Lucky for the dog, they met a kind sheepherder who gave them a roast lamb dinner. Day 38. That summer was the rainiest in memory. What happens when dirt roads mix with buckets and buckets of rain? A vehicle can get stuck in the mud 17 times in one day. Day 40. They drove into Cheyenne, Wyoming, where a reporter remarked that the dog did not appear to be enjoying the journey. Bud had no comment. Day 42. The Vermont was only 1/3 of its way to New York City, and Team Packard was just 10 days behind them. Adding to the excitement, soon a third team would join the race, setting out from California in a new Oldsmobile. Was it time to call it quits? No way. Jackson wrote home, "We will get there first. Just watch me now." Watch as Jackson, Crocker, and Bud take a 5-day pause in the middle of a race. It was another mechanical breakdown and another long delay waiting for parts. Forget New York. It looked like they might never make it out of Archer, Wyoming. Finally, on day 46, they made it to Nebraska, where the mud was so thick it nearly covered the tops of their wheels. One treacherous day, they were on the road from sunup till midnight and only traveled 16 miles. Walking would be faster. But they also had good days, and the team was not about to waste those. In one town, people lined the street to see the Vermont, but they didn't get much of a look. Jackson sped through town without stopping. Then they turned a few good days into many good days. Suddenly, the Vermont was averaging nearly 150 miles per day. Maybe, just maybe, it would be easy street from here on out. The Vermont rolled into Chicago on July 17th and was greeted by an enthusiastic crowd. They knew Jackson, Crocker, and Bud were possibly making history. The trio didn't stay long, only one night. Jackson was eager to get on to New York, but Bud wanted to see more of the Windy City. When it was time to leave, they couldn't find him anywhere. They searched and searched and searched. Jackson would not give up on the race, and he would not give up on Bud. After 4 hours, and with the help of strangers, they finally chased down the bulldog. From there, it was on to South Bend, Toledo, and then Cleveland. They were nearly to the New York State border. Jackson was certain the worst was over. Sure, they sometimes got lost. Sure, they sometimes broke down. But at least they had been accident-free. So far. Crash! Bang! Ah! On July 21st, with about 500 miles to go, the Vermont struck something in the road. The two men and Bud were flung into the air. Seat belts, a windshield, or even a roof would have been helpful here. This could have been a disaster. This could have been deadly. This could have been the end of the road. Yet they all escaped serious injury, and the Vermont was only slightly damaged. Lucky break. Their arrival in New York City grew closer, and the entire nation, even the president, waited for the news. Could a doctor, a bike racer, and a bulldog be the first to cross the country in an automobile? 400 miles to go. 300 miles to go. 200 miles to go. 100 miles to go. For the last 50 miles, Jackson's wife, news reporters, and Winton Motor Carriage Company officials joined the incredible journey for the home stretch. You can do it, Jackson! But then, in the middle of the night, pop, another busted tire. As the men fixed the flat beneath a hotel light, Bud had had enough and wandered off again. They were so close. They had to finish, and they had to finish together. Jackson called out for his dog. Faithful Bud answered his master's cry and hopped into the Vermont. Next stop, victory! July 26, 1903, New York City. On Sunday morning, 63 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes after they began, the mud-covered Vermont drove into New York City before sunrise. Jackson honked the horn to wake the sleeping city, or at least wake the doorman of his Manhattan hotel. They'd done it, just like stubborn nothing will stop me Jackson knew they would. Jackson had won the bet. They'd driven across the country in less than 3 months. However, his $50 wager had cost him over $8,000, and he never bothered to collect his winnings. What happened to the other racers? Well, Jackson had been wrong about them. They did not give up. Team Packard arrived in New York a few weeks later. They were more than a day faster overall, but still second place in the history books. The Oldsmobile team took 72 days to reach New York and then continued on to Boston to dip their tires in the Atlantic, calling their journey the first sea-to-sea vehicle expedition. Still, that's third place in the record books. Bud lived the rest of his life with the Jackson family. Crocker went on to have another driving adventure in Europe. And Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson, now an experienced driver and decent mechanic himself, continued to drive the Vermont around his hometown, sometimes a little too fast. On October 3rd, 1903, Jackson received a ticket for speeding. He was going over the 6 miles per hour speed limit. So, there it is, the absolutely true story of a ridiculous journey that started as a bet, turned into a race, and ended in a surprising victory. The end.